Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us today. It's my pleasure to host this webinar as a joint webinar between the Global Citizenship Observatory, Global CIT. With us on behalf of Global CIT, we have Martin Fink, and also with the Migration Policy Center, MPC. And with MPC, we have Andrew Geddes joining us as well today. So this is a joint webinar. Both MPC and Global CIT are at the European University Institute. And we are very delighted to have our speaker here today, Antoine Bilodeau, who's a professor of political science at Concordia University. And Dr. Bilodeau researches the political integration of immigrants in Canada and other Western democracies. He's also interested in understanding the roots and views towards immigration and ethnic diversity, which those topics we'll certainly hear about today. So he's going to be presenting a paper that's co-authored also with Dr. Audrey Gagnon, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo, who can't join us today, but she is working within the Center for Research on Extremism and working on the normalization of the far right in Norway, France, and Quebec. She's also interested in national identity and opinions on immigration. Hence this paper. And I'll be the chair today. I'm Vicky Finn, a Max Weber Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Antoine. You have the floor if you would like to share your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Vicky. So while I'm sharing my file, I'll just take a moment. Thank you, Vicky, and also the EUI and the Migration Policy Center for hosting me this morning. I'm sharing right away. Here we go. So as Vicky was saying, this is a paper that's co-authored. Oops, this is the last slide. So let me just. So this is a paper co-authored with Audrey Gagnon at the University of Oslo. Unfortunately, Audrey cannot be here with us today. But I wanted to emphasize her contribution, of course. So the paper is part of a special issue that hopefully should appear in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies in the coming months. We'll see about that. The paper is based in a context of the big change that took place or is taking place in immigration selection policies in most liberal democracies, where they are moving away from national origins as the criteria for selections in immigrants, a move Canada did several decades or a few decades already, and increasingly towards more economic considerations or criteria for selecting immigrants. What we do know more formally from research now, which we suspected already, is that the public, even though the policy has changed, the public still has preferences in the national origins of immigrants that are admitted. So essentially, skills may be good, but there are still national preferences. So groups are preferred over others. So it puts us in a context, or governments put in a context where they kind of face the challenge to, in a way, sway the public to accept these new groups of immigrants that are, in most of the time, legally and legitimately, admitted in the country, and yet that the public sees as somewhat less desirable from different perspectives. So so that's the setup of the paper, and the question we ask in this context is, well, how much is economic selection? So a more rigorous, and very selective process where we select immigrants based on their skills and employability criteria. How much can that make a difference? Can that really lead the public to see in a more positive manner groups of immigrants that they would otherwise not enjoy? So that's the context of the paper. We base our research in Quebec, so we use Quebec as a case for our paper. So, for those who are not familiar, Quebec is the francophone province of Canada. This is the only province where the majority of the population is French-speaking, and also where French is the only official language of provincial institutions. So that makes it a very kind of a unique case that quite distinct from other, the rest of Canada or the US, and in a way makes Quebec a bit of a more, a case that we like to believe, at least often in not everywhere, in any ways, but in many ways connects with the European experience because of its unique culture and its unique language. As I mentioned briefly, Canada also switched to the point system for selecting immigrants in 1967, where it now emphasizes skills and employability as the main criteria for admission to Canada. Even though there's been lots of minor changes to the system since 1967, it's the same spirit that guides the selections of immigrants today around that point system. Where Quebec is quite unique here is that it entirely controls the selections of immigrants that are admitted through the point system. So there are different categories. Some of them are of immigrants like refugees and family reunifications that are controlled by the federal government. But when it comes to immigrants admitted through the point system, it is the Quebec government who selects them and also decides of the criteria that are being used. And here, the Quebec government is distinct from the rest of Canada, where a greater emphasis is put on the knowledge of French, as opposed to the knowledge of English or French in the rest of the country. So with this change in the selection policy that started in 1967, we've seen since then a great increase in diversifications of immigration and really moving away from a primarily European and now really immigrants coming from all countries and regions around the world. Well, where it gets a bit even more interesting for us is that despite this, and maybe the image that you have of Canada as being, the image that sometimes we like to circulate of being the heaven for immigrants and the paradise and the perfect system for immigration, there are still in Canada, but maybe sometimes more particularly in Quebec, concerns and debates about immigrant integration in the province. There's a long history of linguistic insecurities in Quebec about the preservation of French, the survival of the French language, which was been there for a while and it's still ongoing. But over the last couple of decades, there's been growing concerns about the cultural integration of immigrants in the province, primarily driven by what has been called now the reasonable accommodation debate around 2006, where lots of questions started being asked about how much we should accommodate, especially religious minorities who were asking for different exemptions, for instance, when it comes to like physical education and so on. So that's the case of Quebec and the debate, which leads us to the questions we'll ask. So the first question is, to what extent do we actually have national origins, but also social class preferences in immigrant selection? Does that really structure whether people appreciate immigrants or not? And second question, we'll see if really more specifically the questions I kind of flagged at the beginning, which is, well, can we overcome negative preferences towards immigrants of certain groups if we select them based on special social class status or a set of skills? And finally, the third question, which will actually occupy quite a lot of time in the presentation, is, well, we'll try to understand a little bit more what lies behind the gap in national origin preferences, kind of a little bit killing the punch here that we will observe some of them. And more specifically, we'll pay attention to what role what we call integration anticipations play. And by integration anticipations, we actually refer to, do immigrants anticipate or expect that, do people anticipate immigrants to successfully integrate or not in various spheres of life, primarily cultural and economic? So that's the plan for today. So quickly, we'll be trying to explore different hypotheses. The first one emphasizes the cultural threat perspective. So based on the works of others, including Ford, the questions will be really testing or expectations more specifically will be that, respondents will evaluate more positively immigrants from certain ethno-cultural groups, primarily those that are similar as their own background. We also be exploring the economic threat perspective. Here, we know from research that there is evidence that upper class immigrants tend to be preferred over lower class immigrants. but we haven't seen much evidence in that line of investigation first, but also not much evidence contrasting or telling us what's happening with the middle-class immigrants, which is increasingly the group that is being targeted by these economically selective policies. So how are they perceived? And we kind of can at least, expect at least two different possibilities. The first one being that the higher the social class, the more positive the evaluations of immigrants should be. So following some sort of a linear fashion from lower to middle to upper class. So we like people with skills, we like people with resources, or we prefer them. But the second perspective could actually be emphasizing the fact that the middle class could be least positively evaluated. I mean, our governments are based on the premise of selecting middle-class immigrants for most of the time, because this is the model of our societies. This is where we have lots of jobs. But in a way, you could expect that this is where the reactions could be least positive, because all these immigrants in middle-class category, in a way, we could suspect, or be the ones who most directly be in economic competition with the rest of the middle class of the host societies. And finally, which is not really an hypothesis, like I mentioned, we'll be exploring the role of cultural and economic integration anticipations. And here our broad kind of expectations will be that people will expect immigrants to integrate successfully or not, depending on their origins and their social class. So that should vary. And we believe it should vary in two different ways. The first one, which would be the most intuitive one that we would expect, is that levels of expectations or anticipations will vary by groups. So some groups will be expected to do well economically and others won't. But we also be looking at the impact of those expectations or anticipations. So essentially here we say, when evaluating immigrants, it's one thing to believe they will integrate successfully or not, but essentially what we'll be testing is the salience of it. Essentially, does that matter in your opinion? So does the expectations or anticipations of integration actually has some leverage in predicting your evaluations as to whether or not you like that immigrant? So very important nuance. I'm going to come back to that later in the presentation. The data we use for the projects are based on the 18-minute online survey that we conducted about a year ago, a bit more than a year ago. And that was conducted in French only, with a sample size of 2,400 respondents. Our target group of respondents, which explains why we only surveyed people in French, was what we call majority group Quebecers. So there are people who were born in Canada that have French as their mother tongue and who are white in racial background. So essentially, the most likely profile of people you would meet in the province of Quebec still today. In the survey, we had an embedded experiment where we ask, as you will see on the next slides, people to evaluate immigrant candidates. So we had 6 different vignettes or profiles. Respondents were presented with only one profile, and they had to evaluate it. So we contrast 2 national origins, France and Algeria. So we made those choices because they are both very important countries of origins for migrants in Quebec today. So they're both large, relatively of the same size, and they're both in the top 5 of origin countries in the last few years. Very important in the context of Quebec as well. Both countries are French-speaking. Algeria is not only French-speaking, but French is a very important language over there. And in our experiment, we presented immigrants as francophones. To neutralize the French aspect. It was very important in the context of our experiments, because we believe if we had not presented to francophone groups, given the huge, very salient sensitivity of French in Quebec, it would have stolen most of the variants and stole the show essentially. So 2 francophone groups. Where the 2 groups differ, sorry, and it's very important for our presentation, our paper, is they are distinct in terms of ethnocultural and religious backgrounds, with obvious, I don't think I need to elaborate on that, but also most importantly is that France hold a special relationship with Quebec from a historical and cultural perspective. So we have 2 groups, one that is more kind of traditional, old stock relationships, similar ethno-cultural religious backgrounds, and another one that is newer, ethnically different, religiously different in most of cases. So we thought it was a good setup, and hopefully you share our decision. So the experiment is as follows. So essentially, people were asked to imagine that they were an immigration officer for the Quebec government, more specifically the Ministry of Immigration, and their job was to select immigrants who would come to settle permanently in Quebec. And so they had this file. Essentially, what you see on the screen is pretty much what they were showing. And then after that, we asked them a few questions in evaluating and assessing the profile, singular, that they had been presented. So everyone was presented with a candidate that was at the age 34, that was a man. We would have liked to vary the gender of the respondent, but we didn't have a large enough sample size. That was getting too complicated. And we've focused on men instead of women because we still believe, well, for different reasons. First, we thought that the threat factor could be more acutely activated if it was a man instead of a woman. But also in terms of credibility, still today in Canada, the majority of applicants who go through the point system, the main applicants are men over women. So that was a bit more credible. So we varied Algeria and France. Everyone was presented as being French speaking. And then we also varied the skills or employment or the social class, depending which word you prefer. So people were presented with a maintenance worker, so what we qualify as a lower class, a computer technician as a proxy for middle class, and also a businessman as a proxy for upper class. And we presented I don't remember the exact wording, but it was like a successful businessman or something like that. So what do we have? If we move to the results, because it's taking much longer than I expected. To what extent do we have national origins and social class structure preferences? So one of the questions we asked them, actually at the end, was, well, overall, how they would evaluate the candidate on a 0 to 10 scale, where 5 is the minimum score to be admitted. The mean score provided was actually quite high, with 7.7 for all candidates. And what you see here are the results where we do not, we only distinguish national origins and social class. We don't interact them, okay, more specifically. So overall, as we could have expected, there is a national origin gap of about, actually less than a point, but that is statistically significant. It was a bit of a surprise to us. We would expect that the gap would be larger than this. Maybe we can come back in the discussion as to why this may not be as large as we expected. But there is, as we expected, preferences for a French origin candidate. And we also observe differences in terms of social class preferences, with computer technicians and businessmen being preferred over maintenance workers. But we didn't see any difference between computer technicians and businessmen. If we move to the next question, which was really the base of our, the heart of our discussion, that would be quick, but which is ultimately the question we're trying to answer, which is, well, can we overcome negative preferences towards those Algerian immigrants if we present them or select them based on their social class? So the first observation that we'll have is that regardless of the social class profile or the job that the candidate were presenting, there is a national origin preferences. So from maintenance workers, computer technicians, and business people, French candidates are systematically preferred over Algerian candidates. So that there's no doubt about that. When we compare across the social classes within each national group, what we observe is different trends, actually. So when we look at the Algerians, it is in the lines of the linear progressions that we were expecting. So essentially the least prefers are the maintenance workers, and the most prefers are the businessmen. The difference between the computer technician and the businessmen among the Algerian candidates is close to statistically significant, but not quite yet. But you have some evidence of somewhat of a linear progression where, well, it does help if you select them on social class preferences or evaluation rises, but not by much, okay? But what is very important is that regardless of this, the French equivalent will always be preferred, okay? So you can improve the evaluations, but you cannot completely resolve or overcome the gap. On the French side, what is quite interesting is that the most preferred profile was the middle class, so the computer technician. And I don't have quite an explanation for this, but it's interesting to see that it's not the same pattern for both countries of origin. Finally, question number 3. So we ask what lies behind the gap in national origin and what role integration anticipations play. Then we ask a series of questions where respondents had to evaluate candidates based on the following statements that you can see, and they had to indicate whether they strongly agree or strongly disagree with them. So the economic dimension, we asked the immigrant will contribute to Quebec's economy, but also the immigrant will help address the shortage of labor in Quebec. For a cultural dimension, we ask the immigrant will contribute to the vitality of the French language in Quebec, or the immigrant will easily make friends in Quebec. And finally, we also have a third dimension, which we did not anticipate, and because I believe it would fall under the economic dimension, but it did not correlate with the rest of the items of the economic dimension, which was the welfare burden item, where we ask the respondents to evaluate whether the immigrant would be a burden on the Quebec healthcare and welfare system. And did not quite correlate with either of the two dimensions, or a little bit with both, which I kind of understand after the fact. You can see an economic dimension there, but you could also imagine people see this as a cultural, through a cultural lens. So anyways, we treat this here as a different dimension, and as you will see, there are good reasons to do that. So again, we looked at the levels of anticipations for those 3 dimensions, and after that, we look at how much these statements, or the response to these statements, actually help predict and understand how respondents gave this 0 to 10 final evaluations to the respondents. So in terms of economic integration, maybe not surprisingly, you can see that the variations is not great. I mean, first, evaluations are very positive. So most respondents believe that immigrants, regardless of their class background and their national origins, will successfully integrate economically in Quebec. Okay, there's not much to say here. Here you could say the system works, so the people believe in the systems, immigrants are selected, and they will do well economically. Similarly, when we ran multivariate analysis, where we use these economic, cultural, and welfare burden indicators as predictors of the 0 to 10 evaluation, you can see that economic evaluations is also equally important, regardless of the national origins and regardless of the social class background. So there are no groups that are, judged more severely based on, for whom it is more important or less important to integrate economically. It's the same thing, essentially. So from an economic perspective, there really is some sort of class or national origin variation. Well, maybe not surprisingly, they are somewhat different in terms of levels of anticipations for the cultural integration dimension. But even here, quite interestingly, there is systematically a gap between the French and the Algerian immigrants, but in both cases, the scores are relatively high, okay? So people believe they will successfully integrate. Maybe a side note, quite interesting, one of the 2 items we use here is whether people will contribute to the vitality of French in Quebec. And there was a very steep gap here between the French and the Algerian candidates. And that was quite interesting, considering that both are French-speaking groups and were presented as such in the experiment. Anyway, but maybe not a big surprise here. A national gap, but still very high scores, regardless of the national origin and regardless of the social class. When we evaluate the impact of those anticipations integration on the evaluation score, the final evaluation scores, here we start to see some differences. As a general rule, everyone has to be evaluated positively from a cultural perspective to be appreciated, to be evaluated positively overall. The only exception here, and it's the same scope of effect across the board. The only exceptions are the French businessmen, who surprisingly for them, they seem to be benefiting from some sort of a more generous kind of process of evaluation, which is, well, even when they were not judged or they were not anticipated to integrate culturally to Quebec, it doesn't seem to have an important impact on their overall assessment, okay? But overall, still not much difference. Finally, welfare burden. The French and the Algerian candidates are, here again, not evaluated differently. So they're equally expected to be a burden or not to be a burden. Here, as you can see, the scores are much lower. But we didn't see any significant variations across national origins or even across social classes. Not a single of those groups was perceived to be anticipated to be a bigger or a lesser burden than others on the welfare system. However, and this is where we maybe see the most interesting contrast, is when it comes to the impact of those anticipations on immigrant evaluation. And as you can see, well, maybe except for the French businessmen, which frankly, I can't make sense of, and I'm not going to try to convince you of some sort of explanation, I just can't. But overall, you see quite of a contrast where for Algerian immigrants, it did matter, or it does matter if you expect them to be a burden. When you don't expect them to be more of a burden than the French immigrants, but when you do expect them to be a burden, it did drive down your evaluation of the candidate. And in contrast, again, with the exception of the French businessman, which is a bit bizarre, for the French candidate, you didn't have that. Once again, they were judged to be as much of a burden as the Algerian immigrant candidate. But if you perceive them to be a burden, it did not seem to have an impact on your evaluation of them. Okay. So that concludes a little bit the empirical findings that I had to present to you. And so where we're left with, I mean, there's lots of things that we could talk about. Hopefully we'll have a chance in the discussion. But we do see clear, although more modest, differences in national origins, but also in social class preferences, which is consistent with what we've seen in existing research. Maybe what I want to emphasize is that we observed these differences in spite of what we would call limited manipulations in the experiment, which is the range of our candidates was, I mean, even though we varied social class, varied national origin, was still not that great. I mean, first and foremost, they were all selected immigrants. And I think existing research on the topic that showed big changes, I mean, big gaps in national origins preferences was sometimes associated with maybe some groups come under certain status, like refugees or asylum seekers or family reunifications. In our case, all the candidates were explicitly presented as being selected. So that may explains why maybe the national origins gaps were not as large as we expected. Maybe the French factor was too strong in neutralizing preferences. There was also no image or with the vignette. So it was a very dry, not very primed set of setup. The other hypothesis that I haven't mentioned here that we thought maybe could explain it was the role of, you know, the humanizing aspect of it, which is, we believe, like, and I think there is some evidence that shows that if you involve into an experiment, you have to evaluate a person. And it's not just what do you think of immigrants. You actually have to say something about a specific person. And in our case, this kind of sense of, so this humanization process and even the sense of responsibility might have been increased even more by the fact that we told the respondent that they were an immigration officer. And as such, maybe they felt they had a sense of responsibility of being more professional than they could have been if they were just sitting in their living room and complaining about the news they're watching. Anyway, we can come back to that if you want to. Economic selections and anticipations are key factors in the evaluations you could see. And here the system seems to be pretty working well in the sense that people expected them to do well economically. And that drives quite substantively their evaluations of candidates. We did have some class preferences. And here, but they were not as large as we expected, and here we're a bit of a victim of the debate. I think I don't know how it was in Europe, but I know in Canada, one of the big debate that we had during the pandemic, and we did our survey right after the acute phase of the pandemic, was about the role of essential workers. And most of the essential workers were typically present in the media were like what we would consider lower class people. So there might have been some of the media spin or change in the people's mind about the centrality of lower class people and lower class workers in the good functioning of our institutions and economy. And finally, maybe the last message would be, well, what we gather from this, though, is that economic selections is not a magic wand. So because even though we kind of have a very homogeneous setup in a context where maybe lower class were heightened in preferences, all of this did not overcome national preferences. Okay, we still have differences between the groups, and you won't by magic convince population to accept immigrants that they would otherwise not want to see, that they expect would transform society culturally, to be suddenly very much loved or appreciated because they've been selected on economic criteria. So I'll end there, almost 30 minutes. I apologize for the long presentation, and I'm looking forward for discussing with you.
Great, thanks so much, Antoine. That was very interesting, and for everyone that registered, you should have received the paper as well. So what we'll do now is take a round of questions. And so as this is live streamed, and you can tell the webinar format, please just use the chat function on the screen, and then we'll take your comments and questions as they come in. We'll just start with those that are here on the screen. I'll hand it over to Martin and Andrew. If, for example, maybe Martin, you would like to go first. Any questions or comments to jump off the Q&A for Antoine?
Sure, thanks a lot, Vicky and Antoine. A great paper, and everybody who received the paper and did not read it, I encourage you to read it. It's very interesting. Of course, it contributes to very lively ongoing literature on understanding attitudes, and especially doing so through survey experiment designs. Yeah, there's a lot in the paper, and let me just pick out a couple of things to get things going. So first of all, I'm primarily a citizenship scholar. So what I liked especially, Antoine, is that actually what we see here with regard to migration in some recent survey experiments on attitudes to citizenship, we see sort of comparable things. That's interesting, I think, because it generalizes the argument. It's not only about admitting people, I would say, to the territory, but also we see similar kinds of findings when we talk about admitting migrants once they are on the territory to the citizenry. So you reference, for example, Vicky Donnaloya's paper on attitudes in the UK, where she also finds both origin effects, but also economic contribution effects. And in another paper that Vicky and I did on Italy, we also find that actually economic contribution really matters a lot. I think that's really an important thing to understand. Admission to territory and integration more general. That will be that's something that I take from this as a citizenship scholar. So maybe 3 points I want to push you a bit on. So first of all, on the innovation, the contribution of the paper, then I want to come back to class, and then some comments on the empirical part. So on the contribution, how do you pitch the paper, and what is the key contribution of the paper? And in the introduction, for example, you argue that it has not been tested directly how much immigrant selection based on skills and perceived economic contribution helps to foster greater support for immigration. And my sense was that your overstating that to some extent, because I would say that there is a lot of research on economic contribution, potential economic contribution of immigrants and attitudes towards immigration. What I see as the core contribution is the interaction between the economic contribution and origin characteristics, right? So this overcoming of perhaps sociotropic considerations or ethnocentrism. And secondly, especially understanding what's going on in terms of the mechanism behind that. So in as far as economic contribution plays a role, how does this really work, right? And that's where I think your paper has potential, because you bring in these additional questions on the potential economic contribution of migrants. That does lead to a puzzle, so I come back to this at the end. But I think especially vis-a-vis Heinmüller and Hiscox, who you also mentioned in the 2010 paper that you mentioned in the presentation, you mentioned them under the economic threat argument. But what I take from their paper is that actually it is not so much economic threat, but rather these sociotropic or ethnocentric considerations, because actually what they show in their APSR paper is exactly that economic contribution may play a role, but it doesn't vary by skills level of the respondent, right? So in the sense of economic competition, they don't find that that really plays out in that sense. So I would say the core message that I take from that paper is that actually it's not about economic threat, but it's maybe about more general concerns. Okay, so secondly, something about class. So I know that in the presentation you didn't go into this notion of middle class nation building, but for those of the viewers online who have received the paper and read it, and I also read the paper, I was curious about this idea of middle class nation building, and as I understand it, it's basically the idea that when we think about migration receiving countries, we go countries become increasingly less restrictive in terms of origin country, right? That's no longer acceptable to restrict on race or origin, but become more restrictive in terms of professional skills, right? And I understand that the paper is part of a special issue, and that's why this is emphasized in the paper. But still, class also in the presentation is a quite core concept, right? So first question is, what do you mean by class? Secondly, how does class relate to skills? Because that's why your paper actually differs from the much of the literature, right? If you think of this Heinmüller and Hiscox paper, for example, they talk about skill, right? Low skilled, high skilled migrants. And of course, we can debate also skills. That's also an important, and it's not an easy concept, right? But I would say that maybe class is even more problematic. And so how does the use of class relate to the general literature on attitudes to migration? Well, and the final point on that is transiting to the operationalization, then how do you link that to the operationalization? So in your operationalization, you distinguish between migrants who do maintenance and cleaning, lower class, and then I think that's relatively straightforward, perhaps, although low skilled would be perhaps sort of more orthodox. But then the computer technician and the businessman, that's, I think, problematic both in terms of skills. Typically, when we talk about high-skilled migration, I would, at least in the European context, we talk about IT specialists and so on. So they are typically viewed as highly skilled migrants, but you treat them here as middle class. Whereas the businessman, that's also that's not a typical category in terms of skills. And in terms of class, when you bring in sort of sociological connotations of class, well, businessman can mean a lot of things, right? When we talk about migrant entrepreneurs, and especially in terms of perceptions. Okay, Vicky, can I have 1 more minute to have maybe the last on the empirical design. So first question is, so you apply the vignette design. But was there a specific reason why you did not opt for the conjoined experiment? Because that would have allowed you to vary on more elements of the attributes, gender, origin, and maybe also have more variation in terms of French versus non-French speaking. I think I will leave it with that. If there's room, I can come back to a couple more questions. Thanks a lot, Antoine.
Thank you. Do I answer now?
Yeah,
or?
I think maybe because there was a set of 3, why don't you start to address those, and then we'll take Andrew's question and the one that we have in the chat. So go ahead and tackle these first. Thanks.
Maybe I'll go in the reversed order. So the vignette, the co-joint experiment, it's a good question. I mean, frankly, it was the first time I was actually conducting an experiment, so that we were conducting. So I'm not that familiar. We discussed briefly co-joint experiment. I'm not even less familiar, but my personal sense was maybe it's not founded, but isn't that too much in your face? Sometimes is my initial reaction from a respondent perspective. So I guess we could have done that, but we really didn't want to. Yeah, I don't have any better answer. That to me, it felt like it would have been too much in your face to emphasize the different. But yes, I mean, it could have been done, absolutely. The issue of social class and how we operationalize them, yeah, that's a very good question. It's not a coincidence that I did not emphasize that in the presentation. It's a part of the paper where we may be a bit less comfortable, because it's part of a special issue. There's a team that we need to emphasize more, and you're right. I think we personally think about the experiment more in terms of skills initially than social class. And we tried to build the experiment first around class, but it's a bit of a bizarre notion for respondents to really just, you can't use upper, lower, and lower, middle, and upper class, I think, as a labels, not in the Quebec context. I don't think people would have known what you're referring to. So we tried to associate them with specific profiles. And then it was hard to do it based just on skill. We really struggled to figure out what should be the right set of professions that we present. And the businessman, you're right, doesn't emphasize skills. But for us, it was money. And the way we phrased, I don't remember exactly, but it really does emphasize the financial power, which, by the way, is an issue in Canada, because we even have an investors program, okay, which is a very different set of route for admission. So if you have a lot of money, we're going to welcome you as long as you commit to investing it. So there's a different, so that's also is a kind of a localized issue. Then the IT computer technician, okay, and we also had that discussion about, is it middle class? And I think maybe for me, the final decision was, we have a problem of skills recognition in Canada and in Quebec. And it's very typical to have immigrants who came, for instance, as engineers and IT computers as specialists, and don't get their skills recognized. So they have the skills, but they work on very low social, middle class jobs. For instance, if you have cable television, the person's going to come and do the fix your cable problem. The chances are it's an immigrant with a middle class background with high skills that were not recognized. So it felt right, I think. Anyway, maybe we're wrong, but it was the idea that the IT computer technician would not be associated with higher class, but he would fit more of a middle class. But maybe we're wrong. That's the beauty of launching an experiment, and you think you get it right, and you realize after if you did or not, you'll never know. But yeah, what do we mean by social class? As it's more class of skills, I think you could remove the class aspect from the paper and focus a bit more on skills. It would work. sometimes struggle myself a little bit to understand the middle class immigration nation building project. So I'm not the best person to argue it, but it really is the challenge of, this kind of nation building process that were built around the middle class, and then processes changing, and now it's being done by admitting people from outside will fit with this, but then it brings issues of transforming the core, cultural core that it might have historically represent. But I don't feel I'm doing such a good job, so maybe I'll stop on that question. And you're right. Maybe we have to work on the what is the key contribution, and I like the sociotropic, the emphasis on the sociotropic considerations, and the reference to Ann Mueller, and it brings me to an aspect of the paper that we did not really discuss because we already had too much when we wrote the paper. But some of the additional analyses that we did to connect to what you were mentioning is we did not see any effect of the respondents' own social class. So we tried to see if respondents would react differently based on their level of education or their income level. If they would, react, they would feel more as a threat depending on the social class of the respondents, and we didn't see anything. So which really goes back to it's not so much the respondent's characteristic that is driving the response, but more it seems to be the general anticipated effect of the immigrants on society. Yeah. But yeah, we decided to leave that out of the paper.
Thanks for the answers, Antoine. And I think, you get at this, the wording of the questions and the distinction of the middle class. They're very tough calls in designing the experiment. So it's nice to have a more open conversation about how to go about doing that and drawing on your local knowledge of people's understanding of what they would place that as middle class. So I think it's...
Sorry, just on this, on the initial version, I forgot that on the first version of the experiment, before we ran it, we had the profession, and we also had the expected annual income. So we're trying to get around it. And then we showed it to someone, and the person said, no, so you can't vary the profession and the income, even if they're stable. So you don't know what the respondent will be focusing on. So we decided to remove the income and just keep the profession. But it would have been a bit more explicit, I suppose, if we had done that.
Well,
Sorry,
it sounds like you're getting at what you were trying to see. And also, it struck me as social class as well, because I thought, why not just use skill? But you were trying to measure, of course, something else. And perhaps that reflects a little bit of this positive political discourse that you mentioned near the conclusions in the paper about if people really believe that the system works, and this is a group of selected people and this focus on the middle class, it is different knowing that if you relate highly skilled to very rich or wealthier people, if there's a separate system for that, it sounds like you really did dig into understanding public opinion as reflected in the system that already exists of selecting. I'm going to read off the question that we received from the audience. Celta here is asking about, could the resistance to the Algerian migrant have something to do with demographic nationalism? And by that, meaning the biological reproduction of the national group. So this is a question that goes beyond the cultural reproduction that was specifically mentioned in the questionnaire. And she followed up, or he followed up about, if you could speak a little bit about the nation as such. And I'm guessing that we're talking about Quebec as a nation instead of Canada. So something about the demographic nationalism and how this was captured.
Okay, yeah, well, it goes back to one of which I didn't have time to make too explicit, but the reason we also picked Algerian ethnocultural was a difference, but it's primarily religion. And the debate I was referring to is in the around 2006, we had this big debate about the place of religion in the public sphere. And we're still in it in 2023. We had a legislation in 2019 that regulate which public servants are allowed to wear religious symbols while they are at work, and it's a very unique thing in North America. And this is one of the reasons also I was saying that Quebec really connects with Europe in many ways, because a lot of the debates about cultural insecurity, linguistic insecurities, but also the regulations of religious symbols in the public space, is a very similar debates are happening in Quebec as in the rest of Europe. And the rest of North America doesn't understand at all what's happening in Quebec on these grounds. And given its size in Quebec and its religious practices, the Algerian community is often not explicitly, but implicitly targeted into the debates about religion. So this is one of the reasons we thought also, and also because it's a large group, that we thought the Algerian community was a very good case to examine for our experiment. But also explains why we're surprised that the gap wasn't larger. Because we've done other surveys where we ask people, do you want to have more or fewer immigrants of different groups? And the only group people want to have more are people from Europe or people from France. And one of the groups they least want, they want the least to come are people from like the Middle East or Algeria. So, and the gap is really large in terms of, should be a bit more or fewer immigrants from these countries. So that's why we picked Algeria, and the evaluation scores are not very large. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the questions about the place. So well, what's the nation in Quebec? That's a big question. This is what the debate is. You have people who have a notion of the definition of the of Quebec nation as a more traditional, culturally rooted, and you have another group that is more pluralistic and open for change. That's what we were trying to measure indirectly.
It struck me as well in the paper that you chose not to focus on the religion as an aspect. And of course, you made a lot of decisions offering the vignettes of what to include and what not to include. Like, were you considering religion as part of the implicit profile when choosing Nigerians?
Yeah, it was implicit. We didn't want to make it explicit, and I think it would have been somewhat problematic in the sense that the immigration officers shouldn't bother with that. Like, it's not part of the selection mechanism. But I think on the common sense in the people's respondents, when they think about people from Algeria, rightfully or wrongfully, they'll imagine them all being Muslims.
I would even venture that you should put some of that in the conclusion, at least in the paper, because you can't assume what people are thinking if you didn't ask them. But at the same time, for people who are unfamiliar with the dialogue going on in the region, it would be really helpful to underline that in the conclusion of, like, this is probably what people were thinking of, and it kind of acts as a proxy for that. That would be really helpful for other readers. Andrew, did you have a question as well from before?
Yeah, thank you, Antoine. It's a really interesting paper. So learned a lot reading it. And I wanted to go back just to really quickly to a point you made at the start, because I think you referred to swaying the public. I think just when you began your presentation, you talk about swaying the public. I think that's really interesting because obviously a lot of this research has quite a lot of relevance to very active public debates, and obviously Canada is a particular instance of debate about migration. But it made me think about what stated preferences have in your analysis, because and I suppose it maybe goes a bit beyond the scope of the paper, but it's just interesting to get your thoughts on this, because I was wondering whether the kind of preferences you identify are kind of dependent or independent in your analysis, because that would have quite different implications for the kind of effects of this analysis. Because if preferences are kind of independent, perhaps embedded in deeper factors in Quebecan society, perhaps more broadly than Canada, then essentially what you could look to do is maybe channel existing attitudes. Whereas if preferences are kind of more dependent in your analysis, maybe more scope then to shift attitudes through the kind of evidence that you deploy. So it's kind of this kind of first point you made about swaying the public. I'd just be interested to get your reflection on this question of the kind of status of preference in your analysis. So thanks, and it's really great and interesting paper.
I'm not sure how I know how to answer that question. I mean, we based it on the premise that preferences are malleable and independent, and because it's the underlying assumption in Canada, and that's the discourse. I mean, Canada, as you might have read in the paper, in the late mid 1980s, you had about 70-75% of the Canadian population wanted to reduce immigration. It went to a low of about 25 and somewhere in around 2005, and it's barely up to about 40% who want to reduce immigration. And during that time, immigration, quotas went from about 150,000 a year to now almost 500,000 of permanent. Okay, and so people would say, what's the success of that? And the success is, and people still have preferences for national origin. No one's going to talk about it, but it's obvious if you start polling, there are groups that are preferred to others. And if you could say, do you have a choice? We could bring all of the immigrants from that specific region of the world, and most people would probably say yes, or not most, but a large portion of. So what's behind that? That was the idea, and said it's the instrumentality of, or the utilitarian aspect of this discourse on immigration that emphasizes the economic contribution. That it seems the government has been successful in making people accept immigrants from all over the place, even despite you might say, well, it was 60, 70 years ago, the racist policies that Canada had in place, but societies don't change that quickly, but Canada did make that successful transition. And so what is the success based on? And it seems part of the answer is this capacity to say, immigration is the key to our economic success. And by selecting carefully immigrants, it doesn't really matter where they come from because they're making a contribution. I'm not sure it answers your question, but
no, it's a really. I mean, I'm not sure. I wasn't expecting necessarily kind of the answer to that question, but I think there is something there that's really quite interesting about, because obviously in Canada, from what I understand, the debate about migration generally is far more positive than it would be in many European countries, although sometimes the extent of negativity in European countries is also exaggerated. And then I suppose it just struck me as an interesting question to which it's not necessarily an easy answer, which is if preferences are malleable, then this attempt to disentangle the relative desirability of particular groups becomes very interesting. So I think from what you just said there, that the preferences seem to have an independent status in your analysis.
But just to continue on that, the opposite case that we have sometimes is Quebec, because people say, well, we've had very selective policies beyond economic criteria, but on language, because we want to protect language.
Yeah,
and that meant a lot of immigrants from Northern Africa, first and foremost, maybe Algeria. And then suddenly people are not happy, even though they're French speaking. And then people start to emphasize cultural or religious influences. And then you even have a debate that says we shouldn't bother with language. We should have people coming from anywhere, including Asia, because they're going to be highly skilled. And also maybe because they're not Muslim, but then we're not going to say that. So it's kind of the reverse, which is kind of maybe here shows more the hypocrisy of it, which is you have a set of criteria, you start selecting, and you're getting what you want. The policies are not perfect in terms of language selections, but they work, and yet people are not happy. So I guess it goes back, it's the other end of the spectrum, which is maybe preferences are not, malleable, and they're just hidden in a way.
Thank you.
Well, I think you uncovered, a small part of preferences. And I mean, this is in that regard, certainly the experiment worked. And if, we could all run experiments on all characteristics throughout time, like this would obviously be ideal. But, eliminating the language factor, I think was a nice approach to be able to focus on some of these other aspects to see what else people are judging. Well, the hour flew by, so I do want to end on time. So on behalf of the Migration Policy Center and the Global CIT here at UUI, thank you so much for sharing this paper with us. And we look forward to seeing it in print And thank you everyone for joining us online, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.